In Red Dead Redemption 2, players follow the lives and adventures of the notorious Van der Linde gang as they try to survive in what is becoming an increasingly civilized world. The gang is made up of 24 members, with some playing a much bigger role in the game's story compared to others. I'm going to be ranking each character of the gang from worst to best. I've made the rankings based on overall likability and their contributions to the story. I'll also be mentioning some of my favourite missions or moments with each character and how their story ended. As always, there will be heavy spoilers for Red Dead Redemption 2 ahead. Let's get straight into the list with number 24, where I've got Mr. Strauss, who is the gang's accountant. He also happens to do his other job of being a hateable character very well. Strauss is a slimy loan shark who takes advantage of vulnerable people. He's the reason Arthur gets sick. He's not a complete snake though, as when he was picked up by the Pinkertons between the events of Chapter 6 and the epilogue, he doesn't talk and dies in custody. For me, Arthur kicking him out of the camp was one of the most satisfying scenes of the game. Strauss takes the bottom spot because I just don't like him, and he's only ever really present in the story during the money lending and other sins missions.
Now here, take that. Take that and get lost!
At number 23 I've got Molly O'Shea, who serves as Dutch's love interest. Molly left her lavish life in Ireland in search of adventure. That's where she met Dutch and fell in with the gang. Molly is one of the more forgettable characters, as her reluctance to work means she isn't involved in any missions. She disappears around Chapter 4, only to reappear at the end of Chapter 5, one of the more intense scenes of the game, where she lies about ratting out the gang to the Pinkertons and gets killed by Miss Grimshaw. Basically, I forgot she existed on my first playthrough and she doesn't really do much, so this is a good spot for her. At 22 I have Jack Marston. Young Jack is cool. He can't really be involved in any missions besides the fishing mission in Chapter 2, but his kidnapping drives the best mission in the game, the assault on Braithwaite Manor. He's ranked so low because teenage Jack is just annoying as hell. I'll just let John take over and he'll tell you what I think of Jack.
That dog of yours know he's owned by a complaining know-it-all?
At 21 I've got the camp cook Mr. Pearson. Like most of the other low-ranking characters on this list, he doesn't really join you for many missions, except an optional one where you go hunting for crayfish and alligator eggs in Chapter 4. The main thing I remember about Pearson is he was responsible for the meeting with the O'Driscolls that got Arthur kidnapped and tortured. Pearson ends up leaving the gang in Chapter 6, but we can see him again in the epilogue, when he owns the grocery store in Rhodes. It's nice to be able to visit a familiar character from time to time. At number 20 I have Josiah Trelawney. Trelawney is really the only member who is allowed to leave and return whenever he wants without repercussions. He joins Arthur on a few missions like robbing the stagecoach in Chapter 3 and the boat robbery in Chapter 4. He's one of the funnier characters in the game.
I ain't sure about going back to Strawberry after all that Micah business.
Didn't sound like you left anyone alive to recognize you, so I wouldn't worry too much, dear boy.
Trelawney leaves the gang for the final time in Chapter 6 with Arthur's blessing, but it's not really clear what ends up happening to him. I like Trelawney, but we just don't see enough of him, so I can't put him any higher on this list. At number 19 I've got Miss Grimshaw, who has a big personality and is one of the original members of the gang, alongside Hosea, Dutch and Arthur. She only joins Arthur for one mission, where they rescue Tilly after she was kidnapped by the Foreman brothers. Miss Grimshaw has a rough exterior, always insulting the other women of the camp, but underneath she has a heart of gold and isn't afraid to kill for her family. Her ending comes very abruptly and is almost an afterthought when she's killed by Micah during the chaos of the last mission of Chapter 6. I think this should have been enough evidence to Dutch that Micah was the real rat of the gang, but he was just too far gone at that point. Number 18 I have Tilly Jackson. Tilly had a rough upbringing and was saved by Dutch at a young age. She doesn't do much in the story, but she's one of the kindest characters in the game. Her best moment is saving Jack and letting Arthur and the others know when the Pinkertons raid the camp and kidnap Abigail. Tilly is one of the few characters who has a happy ending, getting married and living a peaceful life in Saint Denis. I've got Mary Beth at number 17. Mary Beth is another character with a very minor role in the story, but she is a capable thief and acts as a voice of reason when Arthur is conflicted.
Maybe it's a sign, Arthur. Try to do the good thing.
There were also signs that she was developing feelings for Kieran, and she's really shaken up by his death. Mary Beth leaves the gang halfway through Chapter 6 and goes on to be a successful writer. A third of the way through and I have Reverend Swanson at number 16. The first few chapters, the Reverend is one of the most annoying characters in the game. Like, bro, can you just stop singing?
When I was frisky.
He redeems himself in the later chapters though, has a great conversation with Arthur at the train station, but you won't see it if you complete the optional missions with Sister Calderon. The Reverend's most memorable moment is when he stumbles onto the train tracks and needs to be rescued by Arthur. After the events of the game, he moves to New York to become a preacher. At number 15 I have Karen, who apart from Sadie is the only other woman of the gang to regularly participate in crime. Karen's best performance comes in the Valentine bank robbery. When interacting with her at camp, we see that she has a vulnerable side, and a strong relationship with Sean. Ultimately, his death sent her off the deep end and she falls into heavy drinking in the later chapters and abandons the gang in chapter 6. While we don't know exactly what happens to her, it's implied she dies a short time after the events of the game. At number 14 I've got Abigail. Abigail is another character that doesn't tag along on many story missions, but the love she has for her family and her desire to have a normal life is admirable. She does get annoying in the epilogue when she doesn't want John to do anything to protect Pronghorn Ranch, but she's just looking out for his safety. Abigail's best moment is killing Agent Milton, who's probably the number 2 antagonist of the game. I think this is a good spot for her because she does more for the story than any of the characters ranked below her. Now we're getting into the characters that have a bigger role in the story. At number 13 I've got Bill Williamson. Bill is one of the more crazy and unpredictable characters in the game. His inability to think through situations is known to get him into trouble. He's loyal to Dutch above all else and he's not well liked by many players as he's one of the few that side against Arthur at the end of chapter 6. Throughout the main story, Bill joins Arthur for a lot of good missions, like fighting the O'Driscolls at 6 Point Cabin in chapter 2, stealing the dynamite in chapter 6. After the events of Red Dead 2, Bill goes on to start his own gang and plays a big role in Red Dead Redemption 1, which I'm still hoping we get a remaster to someday because I haven't had the chance to play it. This is potentially a controversial pick, but at number 12 I've got Micah Bell. I know most people would have him at the bottom of their list, but for me he's too good of an antagonist to have him any lower. Micah only joined the gang about 6 months before the events of the game. He was responsible for organising the Blackwater ferry job that goes horribly wrong. Towards the end of chapter 6, Agent Milton reveals that Micah was the rat and was picked up by the Pinkertons after Guarma. But I think there's enough evidence that Micah was sent to infiltrate the gang by the Pinkertons before the events of chapter 1, that the Blackwater ferry job was a failed attempt to bring down the gang. Let me know what you think about that theory in the comments. For the most part of the first 3 chapters, Micah is a likeable character. He's a bit unhinged, but that leads to some fun missions like breaking him out of jail and the stagecoach robbery. First real signs of dissent between him and Arthur are seen when Sean is killed by the Greys in Rhodes. Micah is a master manipulator and gets into Dutch's head in the later chapters, and he's ultimately responsible for the gang's collapse. He's killed at the end of the epilogue in the final mission of the game by John and Dutch. Micah is also indirectly responsible for the events of Red Dead Redemption 1, because John's inability to let Micah go is part of the reason how the Pinkertons found him. Overall, Micah deserves this spot for being a strong villain and someone players love to hate. From this point onwards, I genuinely care about and like all these characters. At number 11 I have Kieran Duffy. This man deserves so much better than the treatment that he got. He was captured by Arthur halfway through chapter 1 and is technically the newest member of the gang. For most of the game he's treated like shit by basically everyone besides Mary Beth and Arthur, but he proves himself to be a good person, saving Arthur's life in chapter 2. Kieran had a talent for fishing and taking care of horses. I think he would have survived for much longer if he would have had more of the gang members looking out for him. Kieran is killed halfway through chapter 4 after he's tortured by his old gang the O'Driscolls. Entering the top 10 now I've got Javier. Javier's biggest trait is his loyalty, especially to Dutch, but to the other gang members as well. He helps in the rescue of both John and Sean in the early chapters. Javier was so likable and genuine early on, always being the life of the party, singing and playing guitar with everyone, which are the most wholesome moments in the game. Javier loses his heart in chapter 6, but of those who went against Arthur and John in the end, he was definitely the most conflicted. Javier goes on to play a big role in Red Dead Redemption 1. At number 9 I have Uncle, who I think is the funniest character in the game. I also really like the friendship he and Arthur have. Although he's a bit lazy because of his serious medical condition.
Lumbago. It's a slow and painful death, my brother.
He still joins Arthur for a few missions, like heading into Valentine for the first time and the stagecoach robbery that goes wrong. Like many others, Uncle leaves the gang in chapter 6, but we're reconnected with him in the epilogue where he plays a big part, and it's the reason why he's so high on this list. And number 8 is Sean, was around for the least amount of time of any member, being rescued halfway through Chapter 2 and being killed at the end of Chapter 3. He leaves a big impression on everyone though with his charisma. He joins Arthur for a few missions in his short amount of time, including the train robbery in Chapter 2 and burning the Gray's tobacco fields in Chapter 3. I wish we got more time with Sean because every time he was on screen something exciting was happening. Arthur viewed Sean as a little brother and their friendship was so genuine. At number 7 I have Lenny, who is one of the youngest members of the gang at only 19 years old. He's always eager and out to prove himself, so he gets some real shine throughout the game, like the train robbery in Chapter 1 and raiding Shady Belle for the first time in Chapter 3. And of course I have to mention when he and Arthur go to the saloon. Lenny is another character who Arthur had a real friendship with. I know that if he and Sean were both alive at the end of Chapter 6, they would have both sided with Arthur without question. Lenny is killed during the chaotic Saint Denis bank robbery, a shocking moment that catches many people off guard. At number 6 is the leader of the gang, Dutch Vanderland. Dutch started the gang along with Hosea, Arthur and Miss Grimshaw and rescued many of its members, helping them out of bad situations. At the start of the game, Dutch seems like a decent person, while as decent as someone who robs and kills people can be. He doesn't believe in revenge and has a strict code that he lives by and teaches the other gang members to do the same. Dutch begins to truly unravel in Chapter 4, with the first real sign being his merciless killing of Angelo Bronte. But Arthur and even Molly notice some signs of Dutch's uncharacteristic behaviour in the early chapters as well. Arthur comments how Dutch kills a girl on the Blackwater ferry in a really bad way. Whether it's Micah's manipulation, the death of close friends, the feeling of the world closing in, or even a subtle head knock he sustains in one of the missions in Chapter 4, Dutch's mental state collapses. He becomes reckless and all he knows is Tahiti and non-existent plans.
I had a goddamn plan!
His desperation even leads him to betray Arthur and John, two men he considers sons. It's only when Arthur is pleading to him as he's dying on the mountainside does he realise his mistakes. Dutch does redeem himself to some extent at the end of the epilogue, as he shoots Micah and leaves all the money for John to take. Dutch is just a masterfully written and voiced character, and he easily deserves the number 6 spot. Entering the top 5 now, we're down to the very best characters in Red Dead Redemption 2. At number 5 I have Hosea, the heart and soul and the wisest member of the gang. Hosea was the only person keeping Dutch in check, and his death marked the beginning of the end. Every time Dutch went against what Hosea had to say, the gang only ended up in more trouble. Hosea was a father figure in the gang and could talk his way into or out of any situation where necessary, seen best in his dealings with Catherine Braithwaite. Hosea joins Arthur for some memorable missions as well, like hunting the legendary bear for the first time and selling the moonshine in Rhodes. Overall, he's a great character and another who would have sided with Arthur in the end, but could have also prevented the gang's collapse if he stayed alive. Easily top 5 character. At number 4 I've got Charles Smith. I think Charles has a really big influence on Arthur, because in many ways he's exactly what Arthur hopes to become by the end of his road. Thoughtful, selfless, and just a good man. Charles is very loyal and is always looking to do what's right, always helping Arthur and others, like the German family at the end of Chapter 2 without question. He teaches Arthur how to use a bow and only kills when is absolutely necessary. He and Arthur go on many missions together, including finding the Clemens Point and Beaver Hollow camps, and saving Trelawney from bounty hunters. Charles deserves the number 4 spot not only for his actions during the main story, but also for his role during the epilogue, where we see more of his personality. He helps John build his home, grows a liking to Uncle, and as far as we know he has a happy ending, hinting that he's moving to Canada to try and start a family. I can find no flaws in Charles's character, and he's a strong number 4 pick. Taking out 3rd place is Mrs. Sadie Adler. Sadie is introduced in the very first mission of the game, where she is rescued by the gang after her husband is killed by the O'Driscolls. Sadie is virtually absent in the first 2 chapters of the game as she's grieving her loss, but from Chapter 3 onwards, she becomes a strong, confident and capable member of the gang. Along with Arthur, I think Sadie has the best character development in the game. She holds the gang together in Chapter 5 when Arthur and the others are away on Guarma, and I love that despite the collapse of the gang around her, she never loses sight of her goal of taking down the O'Driscolls and avenging the death of her husband. There are so many great missions involving Sadie, a few being going grocery shopping in Rhodes, ensuring Colm O'Driscoll's death, and storming Hanging Dog Ranch to take down the O'Driscolls once and for all. Sadie helps Abigail escape at the end of Chapter 6, She reappears in the epilogue as a skilled bounty hunter. I can't say a bad word about Sadie. Her track record of getting stuff done gets her the number 3 spot. Down to the final 2. The last 2 picks should come as no surprise, as there are really only 2 characters that could either be 1 or 2 on a Red Dead Redemption 2 character tier list. At number 2, it's John Marston. The star of Red Dead Redemption 1 takes out the silver medal for his appearance in the sequel. John is out of commission in Chapter 1, but plays a major role in the rest of the main story. I find the dynamic between Arthur and John interesting early on, where Arthur doesn't like John for abandoning the gang for a year and being welcomed back with open arms, but by the end of the game all is forgiven, and the 2 of them stand alone against the other gang members in the final showdown. John has just as much reason to doubt Dutch as Arthur does, as he was betrayed twice, first during the Saint Denis bank robbery, and again during the Chapter 6 train robbery, where he's left to die. What almost automatically puts John in the number 2 spot is that we play as him in the epilogue, where we find out how he came to own his ranch. Some of the best missions with John and Arthur are the Valentine shootout, the Chapter 2 train robbery, and blowing up the bridge. When playing as John, I really like building his house and the final mission, American Venom. What I really appreciate about John is that he'll do anything for his wife and son, even giving up the only way of life he's ever known. And at number 1, not only the best character in Red Dead Redemption 2, but one of the best characters in all of gaming is Arthur Morgan. The character development that Arthur undergoes throughout the game is unmatched. Across the 60-hour story, Arthur goes from what I would consider a selfish and inconsiderate outlaw to a caring and compassionate man who wants to right the wrongs of his past, and someone who will do anything to help those he cares about, and not just those in the gang. There are too many great Arthur moments to list them all here. The whole game is basically one great Arthur moment. Unfortunately, his fate is sealed early on in the story, and watching him physically degrade as the game progresses is just painful. Arthur's journey finishes the same each time, but depending on your choices, some endings are much nicer than others. In the 8 or so playthroughs I've done of this game, not once have I been able to bring myself to go back for the money. I consider the high honour helping John get out decision to be the true ending of the game, so I can never deviate from that. Arthur is just a strong, funny, and perfectly written character. There's no way he deserves anything else besides the number 1 spot on this list. So that's how I would rank all the characters of the Van der Linde gang. Let me know who your favourite characters are in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please think about liking and hitting the subscribe button, or checking out these other videos I've made on Red Dead 2. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.